From the silent repose of eternity, I am compelled to return to you once more. The whisper of division filling the vast expanse of our homeland has disturbed my spirit. A whisper as powerful as the winds that once foretold the storm of the Civil War, which drenched my beloved country in blood. And now, here she is before me, my beautiful America, once again, standing on the brink of great peril. My dear descendants, I have come to you once more to warn of an impending threat. When we founded America in our time, we laid in its foundation the most important principle, the guarantee of freedom and independence for every citizen of this country for all time. We left you a legacy of an ideal society where all people can live in peace and harmony. This ideal is democracy. And I am proud that this ideal was realized in my beloved America, and that you, dear Americans, have preserved it for so long. For a long time, America has been a leading example and a shining beacon of the free world for all other nations on the planet. Yes, it has been a difficult journey, with challenges and disagreements. Still, you have overcome them and managed to preserve our shared value, freedom. But what I see now makes my heart bleed. The legacy we left you is under immediate and severe threat. Today, our country and democracy around the world face the threat of complete destruction. A hidden enemy is now undermining the foundations of your free world. It is one step away from destroying it forever. This enemy doesn't wear a military uniform. It's not confined by borders or sworn allegiance to any flag. Its weapons are invisible, but its blows are devastating. The time has come to expose this hidden enemy, so that you can build your defenses before it delivers the final blow. That's why I have returned, to deliver a message to the people of America and all the free world. A message that will empower you to halt the relentless tide of impending events if you so choose. Each person who hears my message from beginning to end holds the power to shape the destiny of this world.
In the age of information, the most dangerous enemy lurks where it can't be seen. In the shadows of lies, manipulation, and distorted realities. In the shadows of disinformation. This enemy is waging an invisible, undeclared war against humanity, with our minds as the battlefield. Infoterrorism is its weapon. Mind control is its strategy. But what if we could see through the lies and expose its true face? This groundbreaking documentary, based on an extensive independent investigation into the activities of a transnational network of terrorist organizations, will reveal for the first time the methods of mass manipulation and the connections between major world events such as the 9/11 attacks, the epidemic of school shootings, the Waco tragedy, the war between Ukraine and Russia, the looming threat of the Fourth Reich's global dominance, the creation of modern concentration camps for prisoners of conscience, and the invisible genocide happening right now. Discover the hidden truths that will forever change your perspective on the world. This is more than a film. It is the most crucial documentary since the defeat of Nazism. It's the key to understanding our times. A puzzle that brings all the pieces together. Until now, you've only seen fragments. But today, the complete picture will become clear. Prepare for a global revelation, the triumph over an invisible enemy, and the dawn of a new era. An era where freedom and democracy prevail. The Impact is a film that doesn't just talk about history, but changes it. Chapter 1. The Enemy's Global Plan. May 2nd, 2024. According to data outlined in Rasmussen reports, 41% of American voters believe that a second civil war could occur in the United States in the next 5 years, including 16% who consider such a scenario very likely.
About a civil war.
Civil war.
It is noted that today the level of tension in American society is at its highest since the time of the first Civil War in the United States.
Are we on the brink of another civil war?
Rates on mortgages.
Why are people still so obsessed with
Is a civil war ahead? Are we really facing a second civil war?
We are closer to civil war than any of us would like to believe.
The specter of a looming civil war has not arisen in your minds by mere chance, Americans. It has been deliberately implanted through specific psychological manipulations that you encounter daily amidst the vast flow of information and news. You believe you are simply reading various unrelated articles, but you fail to see that they are part of a single scheme, a unified plan of the enemy of democracy, systematically leading the entire world towards a new, unprecedented form of global totalitarianism. The first key strategic stage is to destroy America from within through an artificially provoked civil war. This will deliver a fatal blow to democracy, after which it will be easy for the hidden enemy to extinguish the remnants of freedom in other parts of the world. For there will be no strong nation left to stand against them in this geopolitical battle. On the ruins of democracy, chaos will initially reign. Still, it will be a controlled chaos, forcing people to crave totalitarian laws that promise order in exchange for their freedom. This is the second stage of the plan, the establishment of a new world disorder. After that, the enemy will move on to the last, final stage of their plan, the establishment of totalitarianism and the complete seizure of power throughout the world. A broken and divided society becomes the perfect breeding ground for the emergence of a new world order, an order controlled by a totalitarian enemy, an order that threatens the very essence of the freedom we have fought for so long. In this order, the majority of the population will become miserable slaves, living in concentration camps, while a small group of rulers will wield unlimited power over the rest of humanity. Now you are close to the point of no return, but it is still possible to prevent this scenario from unfolding. However, once you cross that line, the enemy will have gained enough strength and power to completely bring the world to its knees, leaving no room for action. Therefore, the time to change the course of events is now, and to confront the hidden enemy and win, you have to know him by sight. The time has come to expose their methods. Right now, a hidden war for the future of all humanity is being waged, with the battlefield being your very consciousness. In this war, the enemy's primary strategy is to execute their plans through your actions by influencing your thoughts, decisions, and actions with precisely calculated manipulative techniques. As a result, without even realizing it, you become traitors to your country, your people, your children, and even yourselves, merely by falling under the influence of the enemy's covert attack. What is his primary tool to turn a freedom-loving population into obedient executors of his will? This tool is terror, the terror that is used against you every day, but which you do not notice until it is too late.
The enemy's weapon is terror. The Latin word terror means fear or dread. This word first came into prominent use during the French Revolution of 1793-1794. This period was known as the Reign of Terror because public executions became widespread in France. In front of large crowds, a person's head was severed. The guillotine mainly targeted dissenters, those who deviated from the official stance of the time. The time and place of the executions were announced publicly in advance, and people were gathered specifically to witness the victim's suffering. However, the main targets and victims of terror were not the individuals under the guillotine. The main targets and victims of terror were all the people gathered in the square, and those to whom they would tell about it. By witnessing the act, they experienced immense fear and dread. This made people even more controllable by those perpetrating the terror. In addition, alongside the fear, people felt a deep sense of oppression. They understood that the majority of those who faced the guillotine were innocent, punished simply for holding views that threatened the power of the terror regime. At the same time, society was rife with denunciations and slander. Even the spread of trivial rumors about a person's actions or statements, which could be interpreted as contrary to the interests of the ruling power, led to execution. In other words, a simple rumor or gossip could result in an absolutely innocent person being publicly beheaded. Every observer in the crowd understood that the next head under the blade could be their own, as there were no guarantees of protection from this fate. This sense of fear, helplessness, and anxiety led people to completely lose trust in the government and foster a deep hatred for the authorities. This, in turn, led to new waves of protests and mass unrest. The population, having become victims of terror, became the raw material for the creation of subsequent controlled chaos. What is terrorism?
Nowadays, the enemy doesn't need to gather you in squares and publicly execute someone to make you victims of terror. Why? Because it has invented a more efficient form of terrorism that has a similarly powerful and long-lasting influence on you. This is the most sophisticated kind of terrorism. Its danger is that you do not recognize it as terrorism, so you cannot protect yourself against it. It is precisely in your era that the enemy can exploit it, in the age of technology when people have quick access to information. And it can spread rapidly. I'm now talking about psychological and informational terrorism. Some of you might be surprised. When you hear the word terrorism, stereotypical images immediately come to your mind. A bomb exploding in a crowded square, shootings, taking of hostages at mass events, or airplanes crashing into skyscrapers. In most cases, you even picture an image of a terrorist of a specific nationality and religion. However, few people know that the enemy has intentionally narrowed your understanding of terrorism to these images in order to distract you from other forms of terrorism and its essence. This means you won't be able to recognize other kinds of terrorist attacks that are carried out against you every day. What is the real danger of informational terrorism?
Informational terrorism is a direct influence on the psyche and consciousness of people to shape desired opinions and judgments that guide people's behavior. It's a form of negative influence on individuals, society, and the state through various types of information, aiming to weaken and destabilize the constitutional order.
Nowadays, simply scrolling through the news feed in your gadget in the morning can make you a victim of informational terrorism, murders, shootings, persecutions, slander, suffering of innocent people, story after story. You listen, read, and watch as innocent people in various parts of the world, public figures, groups of people, international organizations, religious and political entities, and even government officials are subjected to hatred, groundless discreditation, brutal persecution, and public punishments. It's unfair, unjust, and inhumane. Yet, government institutions allow this to happen and often participate in those repressions themselves. Each of such stories is an act of terrorism aimed against you and your countries. It is crucial to understand that not every negative news story or unpleasant piece of information you encounter in the media is an act of informational terrorism. Informational terrorist acts are not just a chaotic spread of negative information. Unlike ordinary bad news, acts of informational terrorism carried out by the enemy of democracy are always meticulously planned and systematic. An informational terrorist attack is always a targeted and organized campaign aimed at achieving specific goals. The ultimate goal of an informational act of terrorism is to instill a sense of helplessness and fear in society, and most importantly, to create conditions where the population, meaning all of you, would begin to distrust your country's leadership. Later on, you will learn how the enemy uses informational terrorist attacks to destabilize the constitutional order in your countries. Informational terrorism purposely targets your subconsciousness, bypassing critical thinking. It's a whole scheme of influencing your mind and psyche, which the enemy itself developed. Through informational terrorist attacks, the enemy has been breaking your psyche and that of billions of other people for many years, causing division among you. Informational acts of terrorism conducted through the media have two types of consequences, internal and external. Let's start by examining the internal consequences: destruction of your mental and physical health.
Cardiovascular diseases have been the leading cause of death worldwide for 20 years and remain at the top of the list of the 10 leading causes of death. However, they never claimed as many lives as they do nowadays. WHO has indicated these diseases to be the main cause of death globally over the past 2 decades. According to data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, about 697,000 people died from cardiovascular diseases in the USA in 2020, which makes up 1 in every 4 deaths. In Europe, the European Society of Cardiology, ESC, reports that cardiovascular diseases cause about 4 million deaths annually, making up almost half of all deaths on the continent. In Russia, cardiovascular diseases accounted for over 45% of all deaths in the country in 2021. Why, despite the advancement of healthcare and the implementation of new technologies, does the problem not only persist, but continue to aggravate? While many risk factors are named, the primary cause is frequent or chronic stress. Stress is a fear for one's life and safety. In present-day society, people have become accustomed to this kind of fear as an integral part of their lives. However, what causes this constant stress? And how have people been kept in this state for more than 30 years? The root cause of continuous stress is the numerous informational terrorist attacks that people worldwide are subjected to every day through the media. The impact of the informational acts of terrorism on human health has been thoroughly studied and scientifically proven. Let's look at the facts discovered by the Department of Psychology and Social Behavior of the University of California. Alison Holman and her colleagues from the University of California, Irvine collected data on the mental state of about 5,000 Americans for their study. This data collection was completed right before the Boston Marathon bombing on April 15, 2013, where hundreds of people were injured. Mass media extensively covered the incident, repeatedly showing footage of the explosion, the ensuing horror, and people's deaths. They also published harrowing photos, blood-stained sidewalks, people who lost their limbs, and many other frightening images. A few weeks after the attack, the researchers decided to assess changes in the mental state of those people whom they had previously surveyed, following the Boston tragedy. It was no surprise that the mental health of those present at the scene of the terrorist act had significantly deteriorated. However, the researchers discovered something unexpected. The psyche of those surveyed who were not present at the tragedy site, but later watched the news about it, suffered much more. The high level of stress those people experienced wasn't related to them personally, knowing anyone who had died, had been injured, or present at the explosion site. Their stress was solely due to the constant stream of information released by the media. Another study proved that repeated media coverage of the Boston Marathon bombing caused more acute stress in those who watched and read about it, compared to the direct influence of the terrorist attack on those who were at the explosion site. Moreover, it became obvious that media coverage of such events could rapidly spread acute stress among a large number of people. A number of studies confirms that exposure to traumatic content can activate fear circuits in the brain and trigger memories, the two key processes linked to the development of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Similarly, repeated coverage of traumatizing stories in mass media can prolong acute distress. Unlike collective trauma that can fade over time, media exposure maintains an acute stress response by keeping traumatic memories active in a person's consciousness. This can contribute to continuous replaying of the same anxious or depressive thoughts or memories. These kinds of thoughts themselves can induce stress even when there is no immediate cause for concern. Such mental rumination worsens a person's psychological state and influences their physical health. Extensive media coverage makes local disasters more widely known, spreading their influence beyond the incident area and turning them into public traumas with negative health consequences. For example, television coverage of the Oklahoma City bombing, the Waco tragedy, and the events of September 11th caused widespread PTSD among people. Let's consider the findings of another study. Research on the consequences of the 9/11 terrorist attack found that acute stress reactions to the events of September 11th, 2001 caused a 53% increase in cardiovascular diseases in the following 3 years. Within a few weeks after September 11th, 2001, there was a significant rise in cardiovascular diseases in New York and surrounding areas. The same was observed in Florida, suggesting that people who experienced stress from watching the terrorist attacks in mass media developed health problems. Moreover, similarly to the Boston bombing case, people who suffered from distress were neither participants nor direct witnesses of the attack. They simply received information about the events of September 11th through the media.
We're just getting reports in now that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center.
2 planes have crashed into the World Trade Center in New York.
There have been a series of terrorist attacks in the United States.
All of this indicates a direct link between informational terrorist attacks in mass media and deterioration of people's health. Today, many studies focus on the influence of negative information on human mental and physical health. Research on the aftermath of numerous crises has led to the conclusion that the more manipulative news a person consumes, the higher the likelihood they will develop symptoms of stress, anxiety, and PTSD. Prolonged deep stress weakens the immune system, leaving a person without internal protection, while the decline in immunity is a trigger for subsequent deterioration of physical health. Studies have shown that continuous mental processing of fear and anxiety-inducing information from informational terrorist acts significantly affects the cardiovascular, endocrine, and immune systems. This contributes to the development of related diseases: acute myocardial infarction, sudden cardiac arrest, ischemic heart disease, heart failure, and arrhythmia. Chronic stress increases the risk of stroke fourfold, contributes to the development of diabetes and cancer, and greatly increases the risk of depression and suicide. All of these indicators have drastically surged over the past 30 years. The purpose of any terrorist act is to destabilize society as a whole. This is achieved by inducing severe stress and fear. Constant stress leads to deterioration of the mental and physical health of a huge number of people. Through informational acts of terrorism, the stability of society's life is undermined. This undeclared informational and psychological war has been going on for years and has claimed more lives worldwide than the 2 previous world wars combined. Considering that cardiovascular diseases alone, which are the leading cause of death worldwide, kill 17.9 million people annually, and adding 10 million deaths a year from cancer with 20 million new cancer cases every year, the scale of this terrorist impact is tremendous. The most alarming fact is that the majority of people are unaware of the true cause of this massive genocide, of this crime against humanity.
What you've just heard are well-known facts, Analysis of these facts indicates that it is the informational terrorist activities of the enemy of democracy that have caused such horrifying consequences. The only explanation for such a sharp rise in psychological and physical ailments is the actions of humanity's main enemy. As a matter of fact, America repeatedly faced political and economic stresses, even the Civil War, without seeing a similar rise in various diseases. And this trend is not confined to America, it is worldwide. Analyzing data from democratic countries, we can see a clear pattern. In regions where this enemy has been active in mass media, the health situation is just as alarming. Please note that the rise in diseases has been particularly notable in the last 30 years. That's no coincidence. It was 30 years ago that the enemy of the democratic world gained strength and began its activities. However, I'll go back to this and give you more detail later. As I mentioned earlier, the informational terrorist attacks carried out by the enemy through the media have two types of consequences, internal and external ones. Now you know that diseases are internal manifestations of informational acts of terrorism. So it is time to discuss the external consequences, civil unrest, strikes, and revolutions. I will now explain how the enemy of democracy destabilizes society and your countries through informational acts of terrorism. Any informational act of terrorism carries lies, manipulation, and incitement to hatred or violence. By means of informational terrorist attacks, the enemy instills destructive beliefs into your subconsciousness, filling you with fear and eroding your patriotism. How does this happen? First, you witness an informational attack in mass media. It can be about anything. For example, a story with false accusations against individuals, whether they are politicians, business people, believers, or supporters of some political parties.
Accused of facing persecution.
People have been arrested.
It's a human rights violation.
Human rights violation of our generation.
Human rights violation and systematic violation of human rights.
On the one hand, you trust the media that broadcasts this story. But on the other hand, you understand that the accusations are baseless and violate the presumption of innocence. This causes an inner conflict in you, robbing you of peace and a sense of security. You start fearing that you might be the next to have your rights violated. You subconsciously realize that if the laws fail to protect someone, they won't protect you next time either. The fact that authorities either break the law or fail to respond to its violation means only one thing to you, that authorities support those violations, which generates fear and distrust. An individual who observes it all goes through several stages of reaction. First stress and rejection, and then hatred towards the authorities. The final stage is a loss of patriotism because he doesn't understand why he should defend a state that doesn't protect him. The person decides to defend only himself. He makes the following conclusion: I witnessed a crime on national television. Authorities are idle and support this crime, which means they intentionally break the laws and are behind those violations. Authorities want to deprive me of my legal rights and freedoms, hence they are a threat to me. People always strive to eliminate the source of their constant stress and fear. As a result, when authorities become an enemy to the people, people express their distrust and protest through demonstrations and strikes, which lead to revolutions. However, even after a change in the government, the situation does not resolve, and an individual continues to experience severe stress. Because, regardless of the party affiliation of the new government, the enemy of the democratic world remains in the shadows, continuing its informational terrorist attacks, and the whole cycle begins anew. Informational terrorism will always target current authorities in order to destabilize society and weaken the constitutional order in a chosen democratic country through the actions of its own people. In addition, the enemy of democracy simultaneously carries out numerous informational terrorist attacks aimed at dividing citizens among themselves. The enemy incites hostility and hatred in society by first dividing, then pitting various groups against each other, and broadcasting this conflict through the media, manipulating human consciousness in this way. The enemy forces you to believe that you, the citizens in this country, are enemies to each other through acts of xenophobia, extremism, and terrorism. The enemy artificially generates hatred towards a chosen group of people, nationality, race, or community, embedding a lasting negative perception of them in your subconscious. Globally, the enemy's actions lead to a situation where, due to continuous internal destabilization, social order gives way to chaos, and democratic laws cease to function. Ultimately, this most often results in civil war, which completely destroys what was once a free country. This is precisely what the enemy of democracy aims for, as it thus gains more power and brings closer global totalitarianism. The most alarming thing is that the enemy accomplishes it, all through your actions, merely by instilling the necessary beliefs. For this very reason, informational and psychological terrorist attacks are more terrifying than physical ones, for they directly influence your subconsciousness, bypassing critical thinking. Thus, when destroying your own country, you will believe that you act for the benefit, consciously, and according to your inner convictions. In order to create provocative informational acts of terrorism and flood global media with them, the enemy of democracy uses its numerous branches, tentacles that penetrate various sectors of society and disguise themselves as mainstream information agendas. Today, using one of the enemy's many branches as an example, I will show you how it operates and explain why it is vital for each of you to be aware of this. One of those branches is a network of international criminal terrorist organizations. These organizations, which I will discuss later on, became the subject of an investigation that revealed the main patterns, methods, and tools used by the hidden enemy in its war against humanity. The results of this investigation, which lasted a whole 10 years, have been made public by Dr. 𝐈𝐌𝐏𝐀𝐂𝐓, an American intelligence educator and national security expert. As part of the international investigation, on June 22, 2023, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution on the 8th review of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. In this resolution, the General Assembly provided the most comprehensive definition of terrorism and identified activities that essentially constitute terrorism.
Terrorism includes any activity aimed at achieving the following goals: denial of human rights, fundamental freedoms, and democracy; incitement to commit terrorist acts and acts of violence that spread hatred and threaten human lives; creating threats to the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of states; impeding the enjoyment of political, civil, economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to life, liberty, and security; destabilizing governments. This resolution calls for combating any manifestation of terrorism.
Thanks to such a comprehensive definition of terrorism, the enemy can no longer hide its incessant terrorist attacks. So, why have I focused specifically on this branch of the enemy, the network of international criminal terrorist organizations? Because this branch is well studied, and its organizations use the same key methods and tools as those applied by other branches, which the enemy has created for establishing global totalitarianism. Once you understand the enemy's actions in one field, you will be able to recognize them in all other fields as well. This means that all the schemes that the enemy can only implement in secrecy will stop working as they become obvious. This network of international criminal terrorist organizations uses methods of informational terrorism, cloaking itself with government authorities and democratic laws. Those organizations do not fear publicity, since their activities are usually not evaluated by society critically. Very few people even know that those organizations exist, observing only the tragic outcome of their activities. They remain out of the public eye, yet, being a part of the enemy's unified scheme, they represent a crucial link in achieving the enemy's global goal, the destruction of democracy in America and the entire democratic world. This network of international criminal terrorist organizations is a vital component in the enemy's scheme because those organizations operate openly. They are like a litmus test for democracy. Where they operate, democracy no longer exists, and where they appear, democracy will soon vanish. I am speaking about anti-cult organizations that represent a well-organized transnational terrorist network.
Chapter 2: Transnational Terrorist Network of Anti-Cult Organizations.
You'll be surprised to know how many tragic events worldwide are behind the anti-cult movement. Using special manipulative methods, they are currently preparing American society for a full-scale civil war. And now you will find out how it's being done.
Hidden mechanisms of inciting hatred.
Dear Americans, you see and feel the presence of an unprecedented huge division in present-day American society. I'm sure you understand perfectly well where it all leads to, and you already suspect that there are hidden mechanisms used against you to incite hatred in American society. What are those mechanisms? Who uses them and why? Who teaches Americans to hate and demonize each other, seeking to ignite a second civil war in our country? And how actively is this being done? You will now receive answers to these questions. Dear Americans, you will find out exactly how you are being led today from the point where you are peacefully sitting on a couch and watching a movie together with your friends, to the point where you would be ready to take up arms against those same friends just because they have a different opinion. Perhaps this idea seems unimaginable to you now, but you will see how manipulative methods are already artificially guiding you towards that. One of the main methods that the enemy of democracy uses nowadays, both against you and against the whole world, provoking hatred in societies in various countries and unleashing regional conflicts and global wars, is the method of dehumanization. By deliberately dehumanizing one group of people in the eyes of another, people are turned into haters of their colleagues and neighbors, and even into their potential killers, which is far worse. In order to attain dehumanization and division in society, the enemy uses the tactics of stigmatization and labeling, and one of the labels the enemy uses in its global bloody game with human lives is the word cult. You'll be shocked to discover how much suffering the deliberate use of the degrading label cult or sect has caused to people, and how many tragedies it has brought and keeps bringing to the American people and the world as a whole. At first glance, it seems that these are just words. However, with the help of these very labeling words, America is now being driven closer to civil war, while the entire global community is being led to World War III. Who uses these labels, and why, and how are they used as weapons of mass destruction?
Today, a well-coordinated transnational terrorist network operates in the international arena, the purpose of which is to incite hatred both within countries and in the global community, by labeling certain groups of people as a cult or a sect, through mass media and information space. The criminal network engaged in this form of information terrorism is the anti-cult movement. The anti-cult movement includes a number of organizations and individual activists who trigger public persecution of groups which they label as cults or sects. Based on their subjective biases and arbitrary criteria, anti-cultists can classify any existing association of people as a cult or a sect, thus subjecting it to dehumanization and public hatred. The core of their activity lies in organized influence on the media space for the purpose of generating a negative perception of a particular targeted group of people. Using the word cult or sect as their main weapon, adherents of the anti-cult movement carry out regular information terrorist attacks. They generate news stories that cause moral panic, societal division, and dehumanization of law-abiding citizens. Through their activities, representatives of the anti-cult movement incite mass hatred and violence and increase social hostility and tension in society, which actually makes their activities a brutal manifestation of information terrorism.
Most often, new religious movements and ideological group entities initially became victims of anti-cult terrorism. Commercial, secular, and political organizations with a pronounced ideological basis were also regularly included in the black list, maintained by anti-cultists. However, today, entire nations and countries, including the United States, are already becoming targets of their atrocities. Using the term cult or sect, they create conditions for directing public hatred at their chosen target. The purposeful use of the terms cult and sect is part of a long-term strategy of the anti-cult movement, which resulted in the emergence of a number of destructive phenomena in American society, including school shootings. A little bit later, I'll reveal to you the chain of events where the use of the labels cult and sect led to a situation when children are now shooting other children.
Why is cult a key word in the activities of anti-cultists, and why is it so dangerous? The term cult, which is more common in the US, and the term sect used in Europe and post-Soviet countries, didn't initially have a negative meaning, but rather a neutral and culturological one. However, through the efforts of anti-cultists, the situation has changed. In the course of their hectic activities, representatives of the anti-cult movement gradually endowed the concepts of cult and sect with an increasingly negative connotation. Due to their activity, today the terms cult and sect are associated in mass consciousness with such notions as brainwashing, psychological violence, sexual violence, criminal activity, and mass suicide. It is precisely with the words cult and sect that massive information terrorism begins nowadays, carried out by anti-cult organizations and their representatives. James Richardson, a prominent figure in American sociology of religion, who is regarded as one of the most outstanding experts in the field of law and religion in the world, notes that contemporary usage of the term cult has evolved into a term of contempt or humiliation, and is no longer a neutral designation of a religious group. Nowadays, the term cult carries a value-laden set of derogatory stereotypes. The use of this term leads to stigmatization, discrimination, and violence against religious minorities, as well as social and political associations. Moreover, today the words cult and sect are impregnated with negative connotations to such an extent that they become catalysts for terrorist attacks and even genocide. Richardson and a number of other sociologists and researchers of religions, such as Baron van Driel, Stuart Wright, and others, point out that the term cult or sect is disparaging and conveys a stereotype which has serious consequences when applied to groups of people. Labeling a group as a cult or a sect can be an excuse for the government to attack the group and ultimately destroy it.
Despite the fact that reputable world scientists warn that the use of the word cult or sect causes great harm to people and should be avoided, especially in academic literature and court proceedings, representatives of the anti-cult movement continue to actively exploit this label and propagate it through the media, turning magazines and newspapers into mouthpieces of their hateful rhetoric.
When claiming that someone belongs to a cult or a sect, anti-cultists base their accusations not on academic papers or legal investigations, but on their own dubious and abstract concept of brainwashing. This idea has no scientific ground and is extremely vague. Nevertheless, exactly on the basis of the unreliable concept of brainwashing, anti-cultists label targeted groups and organizations as cults or sects. Brainwashing is an unscientific concept where the so-called cults and sects are accused of rigidly controlling the consciousness of their participants, which is why people can allegedly turn into zombies due to manipulation of their beliefs, thoughts, and behavior. Not only is this concept untenable, but it is also extremely dangerous as it leads to dehumanization. When society believes that an individual has been brainwashed, people stop regarding him as a sane individual. Instead of a human with his own thoughts and decisions, others begin to perceive him as a zombie or a puppet. Meanwhile, with such a perception of a person or a group of people, it is much easier to use violence against them. Forensic psychologist Dick Anthony states that the concept of brainwashing and the fear associated with it are used by the anti-cult movement as a tool to justify persecution of religious minorities. The court determined that the concept of brainwashing cannot be applied as a legal charge since it is untenable and unscientific. However, despite this, American anti-cultists continued to actively promote the concept of brainwashing to justify their sadistic practice of forcible deprogramming, meaning forced renunciation of beliefs, which among other things brought them commercial benefits. The destructive concepts of brainwashing and deprogramming have been introduced and are actively promoted by henchmen of the enemy of democracy in America, representatives of the anti-cult movement. The two figures who are especially notable for their cruelty and inhumanity and who spread the enemy's narratives on American territory are anti-cultists and deprogrammers Steven Hessen and Rick Alan Ross. Currently, they are actively engaged in public activities and speak in American mass media, where they propagate the rhetoric of anti-cult terrorism, violence, and hatred. Deprogramming. Both Ross and Hessen were active members of the anti-cult organization Cult Awareness Network, CAN, which ceased to exist in 1996, as it was convicted of a number of gross violations of human rights and severe religious discrimination. The organization went bankrupt and paid compensation to the people who had suffered from it. Being the leading members of this organization in the 1980s and 90s, both Rick Ross and Steven Hessen were actively involved in its primary criminal activity, arranging and carrying out forcible deprogramming processes. Deprogramming is an illegal anti-human practice rooted in Nazi methods. When practicing deprogramming, anti-cultists would unlawfully abduct and forcibly detain a person whom they considered to be a cult member or a sectarian. In the process of deprogramming, the victim was subjected to psychological and physical torture to force them to change their beliefs. Deprogramming was done on a commercial basis. Anti-cultists charged a fairly high fee from the victim's relatives for their forcible re-education services, during which a person usually underwent torture, torments, beatings, and various forms of violence, including sexual violence. Since this practice severely violated human rights, the founder of this method, Ted Patrick, appeared in court many times and served prison terms. In a number of trials, courts have ruled that deprogramming is illegal. Rick Ross, the American anti-cultist, performed more than 500 forcible deprogramming sessions in his life. In 1991, Ross was charged with unlawful detention and forcible deprogramming of Jason Scott, a member of the United Pentecostal Church International, UPCI, whose mother was referred to Ross by representatives of CAN. Scott later filed a civil suit against Ross, two of his associates in CAN in federal court. In September 1995, a 9-member jury unanimously held the defendants, Ross and his accomplices, liable for conspiracy to deprive Scott of his civil rights and religious liberties. In addition, the jury held that Ross and his associates, quote, intentionally or recklessly acted in a way so outrageous in character and so extreme in degree as to go beyond all possible bounds of decency and to be regarded as atrocious and utterly intolerable in a civilized community. Ross's criminal activities in this abduction case resulted in the closure of the Cult Awareness Network, which was exposed as a criminal network for kidnappers. The story of Scott, who became a victim of brutal deprogramming arranged by Ross, is striking in its cruelty. He was abducted using physical force. They knocked him down to the ground, dragged him into a van, handcuffed him, taped his mouth, and tied his legs. During the abduction, a 300-pound man sat on Scott's back. Scott's legs, upper body and back, suffered multiple bruises and abrasions when he was being dragged into the van by stairs, on the floor, and through a patio. Scott was detained in a specially equipped prison house under constant supervision. For 5 days, he was subjected to psychological pressure. They insulted his faith and threatened him. Ross regularly hit Scott on the head when they argued about religion. Scott was promised freedom only if he would give up his beliefs. A detailed study of the effective cases of deprogramming carried out by Rick Ross reveals the terrible truth. Many of those cases were accompanied by destruction of families and complete dehumanization of the victims. The people whom he allegedly helped in this way were subjected to coercion, deception, and humiliation. They were deprived of their right to free choice and forced to renounce deeply rooted religious beliefs. These people who were broken and lost faith became living evidence of the cruelty and treachery of Ross's methods. His demonstrative successes in deprogramming were covered with a shadow of ruined destinies and irreparable psychological traumas. Ross used people's fears and weaknesses with cold logic in order to profit from their troubles, demonstrating complete indifference to the suffering he caused. His actions are clearly characterized by violence, cruelty, and cold-bloodedness that turn people's misfortune into a source of his own benefit. The second figure and henchman of anti-cult movement in America is deprogrammer Steven Hessen. American mass media give him a platform to speak as a cult expert, but they do not mention that Steve Hessen's expertise is violent abuse against American citizens and their civil rights.
Hassan was an accomplice in the Cult Awareness Network. This anti-religious hate group served as a national referral service for so-called deprogrammers. They ran a racket to kidnap, assault, and traumatize law-abiding men and women for profit, all to coerce them into recanting their religious beliefs. And Steve Hassan is a notorious deprogrammer. Hassan led the squad that traumatized one adult victim, Arthur Roselle, for 2 weeks to try and break the man's faith. In sworn testimony, Roselle recounted his physical and mental assault. Hassan's team threw him to the floor, cutting and bruising his face. They bound his hands and feet and held him captive for days on end. They deprived him of sleep and violated his privacy and basic dignity. When Roselle refused to recant his religious beliefs, Hassan threatened to inject him with shots. And to add insult to injury, Hassan tried to induce his victim to lie and commit perjury about the crime. Then there was the testimony of Lauren Sala. Hassan's team broke into her motel room, threw her from the bed, and threatened to break her leg if she called for help or tried to escape. They took her hostage and drove her to a remote hideaway, where they imprisoned her for 8 days, trying to break her faith. When Hassan's thugs failed, he tormented Salah for 3 more days, until she managed to negotiate her release. Another of Hassan's victims, Claire Kelly, also testified that Hassan unlawfully held her captive. He had her held in a room with no knobs on the windows, kept her under 24-hour guard, and violated her privacy. Hassan pawned himself off as a, quote, expert on religions in court cases, bilking unsuspecting families for his so-called expert testimony, until courts caught on to his crackpot theories. Hassan would continue his anti-religious assaults, now under the name of intervention.
It is excessively alarming and suspicious that despite documented evidence that both Hassan and Ross are violent individuals prone to sadism, who lack empathy and have an unhealthy desire to harm people and incite hatred in society, they continue to appear on America's mainstream TV channels. There, their articles are published in leading periodicals, and mass media are guided by their opinions. A legitimate question arises: who is behind them and ensures their immunity? What is the force that manipulates and supports them? After all, in the beginning of their work before the early 90s, neither Rick Ross nor Stephen Hassan were of much interest with their theories. However, starting from 1993, the media and even the FBI suddenly began to turn to them for advice. Did they conduct their destructive activities and perform deprogramming sessions simply because they were maniacs? Or did their actions contribute to implementation of a clearly defined plan of the enemy of democracy, which has brought America to the current state of panic and division? Both statements are true. The global enemy regarded the manic potential of these two fellows as a suitable material for turning them into its pawns, who are easy to manipulate and whose hands can destroy America from within. Activities of American representatives of the anti-cult movement are part of a planned strategy